but they'll say, "Oh, um, that was a big accident. You must have been speeding," even though someone was breaking the law and pulling out in front of someone else, causing the accident. And we've seen, you and I have worked on cases where they denied it outright uh, in that situation, and have been successful in arguing that is just BS. I mean, and it's something that we see
This is a family show,
insurance
Mike.
companies
This is a
do.
family show.
That is Bull Honky Insurance Company. Um,
Welcome to the first ever episode of Legalese. I am the layman, Matt Patton, and this is the expert, my brother Mike Patton. And in this series, we're just going to talk about different kinds of common everyday legal concerns that people can run into, and we're going to pick Mike's brain to see what useful things we might discover about how to navigate legal concerns in everyday life. We will also explore things we're not experts in because we are also middle-aged white guys doing a podcast. So that's what middle-aged white guys also do in podcasts. Let's talk about things they're not experts in. So um, without further ado, maybe Mike, give a little bit of context history about the firm.
yeah.
Um,
So first and foremost, we are a family-oriented personal injury law firm. And what I mean by family-oriented is it was started by our dad over 40 years ago. He practiced with our mom for the vast majority of that time. And then I came into the law firm in 2011. I've been practicing since then for almost 14 years now, which is wild to me. And in that time, I've transferred into the managing partner role in running the day-to-day operations. And so that is a unique thing about our law firm is our family has run it for years, and now we have uh, my older sister is a lawyer that works at the firm. Matt is in charge of marketing, comes up with ideas like let's do a podcast, which we're doing now. And Joey also manages day-to-day operations and finance stuff as well. So truly, it is a family business, which is a unique privilege to be able to work, with people you love, doing something that we love, helping people. It's a great privilege. So that's who we are.
Okay, so let's get into the expert portion of the conversation. So, one of the things that people find themselves, situations that find themselves in, or loved ones, pretty often, is a car accident, and it's a little bit confusing. I've been in a car accident. You've been in a car accident, and it's a pretty scary experience. Um, when I was if you're familiar with the Kansas City area, I was merging onto 435 off of I-35, and I started fishtailing, uh, and because the road was wet, and then I went sideways, and somebody hit me, and glass shattered. It was a pretty freaky experience. So, Mike, if you were in an accident tomorrow, and you have something like that happen, you're pretty rattled. What are the next few things that you're going to be thinking about?
Sure. So one of the number one things that I would recommend that you do when you're in an auto accident is to make sure that you call the police. I see this all the time. People get out of their cars, they're very rattled, and they don't do that. Someone suggests, hey, let's just exchange information, try to keep it easy. And that almost never is the right thing to do. You want the police to come out. You want them to do an investigation of what happened, and that will just ensure that the case is handled properly. The other thing to do is take a lot of photos. We all carry these things in our pockets that can help us document right away what happened accurately. So and it's great evidence in these kinds of cases. Right after the accident, you're not thinking about these things. So that's why, we give this advice now, so that maybe, okay, call the police, take photos. After the accident, one thing to avoid is to give a recorded statement to the insurance company. There's a lot of fine people that work at insurance companies, but their goal in taking your statement is not to help you. And so you absolutely need to talk to an attorney's office like me. Give me a call before you're giving statements to insurance companies, because they can ask leading questions. They will try to minimize your injuries if you have injuries. So that is those are three things that I wish everyone knew going into that kind of accident.
So what kind of a role is this accident? What kind of role is calling the police, having them do an accident report? What is that doing for a person who's been in an accident?
It documents accurately what happened. You want to believe the best in people. However, I cannot tell you how many cases I've had over the last 14 years where someone after the fact is telling an insurance company something different than what happened at the scene of the accident. And then if you just have a he said, she said, it's very difficult to figure out what happened. Now, in modern day era, we can do things like try to find a recording of the accident. That's happened in many of our cases. Lots of ring videos out there now and that sort of thing. But the best thing you can do is have the police out there taking statements and doing an investigation, so that nobody's story changes later. In Kansas, there's a hearsay rule that actually so do you know what hearsay is, Matt?
Somebody
Sure.
else said it.
Yeah.
Is that what that means?
That's
I heard someone say it.
It is the statement made by another person. And so the general rule is you cannot testify as to what someone else said in the court of law. And there are exceptions. And one of the exceptions is in the moment declaration. So if someone jumps out of a car and says, "Oh, it's all my fault," that's admissible. And you can testify to that person saying that, because the law is saying that's a more reliable statement. Also, statements against interest for parties is admissible. So you want those things on the record when a police officer is arriving at the scene. So they also have body cam footage, which is always effective evidence in these kinds of cases.
What do you do if you did have the police come out, you get an accident report back, and you notice that it's not accurate?
So you can talk to the investigating officer. You have a right to do that and say, "Hey, this fact isn't right." And the best thing to do if that happens is to call the police station and call the officer and explain what happened, and they'll hear you out. I mean, they're trying to get it right too. And so if there's some sort of mistake, call and get a correction as soon as possible.
And then how do witnesses to accidents come into play?
So witnesses become very important, because an objective source of what happened in the accident, meaning not a party, whenever we have those, that is extremely helpful in determining liability in an accident. And so the police often take those statements. Sometimes we have an investigator and he'll go take statements. Sometimes we'll send Matt out to go take statements. And all of that evidence is very effective and useful in one, persuading an insurance company to do the right thing and pay a full value for a settlement. And if we have to, present that evidence in court.
What are some of the more common issues that you hear insurance companies raise to try to confuse or obfuscate liability in an accident?
I think for liability, the most common tactic used by insurance companies has to do with Kansas's comparative fault rule. So they will try to lower the value of a claim by assigning some fault onto a driver who really wasn't at fault. So I see this most often in like a failure to yield case. So those are pretty obvious to most people, right? You have a duty to yield to oncoming traffic. You can't just pull out in front of people. Well, insurance companies almost always in those cases, maybe not always, but often will argue, well, the other person was going too fast. And they don't have any evidence of that because no one clocked these vehicles. They're just going by assumptions that I would argue are inadmissible, meaning they are assumptions and should not be allowed to be heard by a jury. But they'll say, "Oh, that was a big accident. You must have been speeding, even though someone was breaking the law and pulling out in front of someone else, causing the accident." And we've seen, you and I have worked on cases where they denied it outright in that situation, and we have been successful in arguing that is just BS. I mean, and it's something we see.
This is a family show,
insurance
Mike. This is a family show.
That is bull honky insurance company. But it's something we see a lot, and it is something we've been effective at arguing. And they're just hoping that the person just accepts, oh, that's what the insurance company said. I guess I don't get a claim, and that's not fair.
Yeah.
And it's not justice.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. That was very helpful. And so now let's transition to the non-expert portion of the conversation. What have you been thinking about or learning about?
So the most interesting thing I learned about this week was I watched a podcast with Jordan Peterson and Arthur Brooks, two authors who I've read most of their work and enjoyed quite a bit of it. Jordan Peterson has some controversial things he says, but that makes him interesting. And Arthur Brooks does too, but mostly within the space of politics. He says, he wrote a book called Love Your Enemies, and he means it. He says you really ought to love people, that even people you disagree with. There's a couple other people we admire that said that. So
that's controversial. That's a controversial take these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So at any rate, the discussion was interesting for them, and they primarily talked about happiness and what makes you happy in life. And they were talking about how being a goal-oriented person makes you happier, having ever-expanding fields of attainment, and the fact that attaining the goal doesn't actually make you happy, but pursuing the goal can make you happy. And they also defined happiness as something more than just pleasure. Happiness is something that occurs in a relational, it occurs in an environment with relationships. And so they discussed that at length, and it was, it's interesting.
And it's funny that you're listening to a happiness researcher this week for our newsletter. this month that we mailed out. Um, I wrote an article on sadness.
That's funny.
It's
I didn't
about
read
Lent.
that. What did?
It's about Lent.
Okay.
I'll send it to you
Yeah.
soon. But it's about
Yeah.
yeah, feeling sad. So it's a nice little contrast.
Well, one of the paths to contentment, according to these two authors, is suffering. And in life, people are going to suffer. We see it firsthand. We meet people who are suffering regularly. Life throws things at you you're not expecting. But uh, if you choose to respond to that uh, positively, meaning you can learn from that experience. Uh, there's meaning in suffering. So
Yeah.
that was the other thing they talked about. And for you and I, we're like, who else told us about suffering? It was Jesus. So
Yeah,
that,
I mean, we discussed it in my Bible study this week. We were in First Peter 3, and First Peter 2 and 3 has a lot about that kind of thing. And there's a verse at the end of First Peter 2 about Jesus walking through suffering, and um, it says he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly, which I always think about a lot because I think one of the things that Peter's talking about suffering unjustly, for suffering things that are not just. Um, and so, in that context, Jesus, as the example, is um, has this trust that all things are going to be sorted out one way or the other um, at some point along the road by God, which can kind of create a sense of peace in it. But that does, that requires trust, which is also not easy in the midst of suffering. So,
yeah, yeah. And the trust element of that is difficult, but it is good. So, anytime we face some sort of injustice or begin suffering, there's part of us that rightly wants that to be rectified. And we live within these constraints of time and space. Um, and God has a broader perspective on that. And so sometimes our timing, we would like justice now. And God forbears his justice. And that's actually a good thing for us too.
mm-hmm.
Uh, and and I think that's, I don't know. The I'd be curious. You're the expert on theology, uh, but I think that's one of the messages of Job is you need some humility within the suffering because Job at the end of the book he's like this is unjust and he kind of calls out God and God's response is you're you're too small. I am too big. You are small in comparison to who I
Mm-hmm.
am. And then there's Job finds some comfort in that humble space.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, a call to humility within suffering is hard, but also really good.
Yeah. And there's like two sides of that coin in Job. Like there's the humble posture of recognizing like I'm not God. And so, um, but then there's another side of that coin where you can try to like fit your experience of suffering into a clearly definable rubric. And that's what a lot of the book is about. His friends are trying to define his suffering in this clear rubric. You've done bad in the past, and that's why you're suffering now. And it's there's kind of a lack of humility in that posture too, where you're trying to assign too much order. And I can explain what's happening in the midst of suffering. Um, when there's that humble posture of a recognition of like, uh, actually, I can't wrap my head around it. But then there's also a healthy posture of trust that God is not absent in the midst of it. And I think for a Christian, your hope for that, your ability to have that posture of trust is in the gospel, that God did not stand far away or aloof from our suffering, but he actually got involved. And there's this kind of solidarity in the cross that he took on suffering. He understands our suffering because he took it on. So he's not standing far off and aloof. So that's a sort of an anchor for our confidence and trust that for God in the midst of the suffering. So
Yeah. So yeah. Well,
okay.
Worked in the gospel in there.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
guess that's good that it's
Talking
at the
about
top
things
of our
beyond
mind.
our pay grade. Well, thank you.
Everybody wants theological advice from a personal injury attorney. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for listening and bearing with both the expert and non-expert portion of the conversation. And this will be something we try to release on a weekly basis. So tune in next week, and we'll have another conversation with Mike on making plain and understandable legalese. We'll see you next time.